Hello, everybody, and welcome to our esteemed speakers, Professor Mark Girolami, a computational statistician, and the Sir Kirby Lang Professor of Civil Engineering at the University of Cambridge, Dr. Laura Manny, a research associate in the Communication Outreach of Global Catastrophic Risk at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, and Professor Jonathan Nitschke, a supramolecular chemist and Professor of Chemistry at the University of Cambridge. And welcome to all of those watching from home, RGS governors, staff, students, OGs, and the wider academic community of Guildford. Thank you all for joining us this year for our virtual scholarship conference. I hope you have found the recorded lectures as stimulating as we have, and thank you to all of those who have already submitted questions. If you would like to submit questions during the interview, you may do so via the Teams Submit Question function. And over to Ben for the first question.
So I'll kick us off. So the big thing that's happened in the last year, if in case you haven't noticed, has pretty much been the COVID-19 pandemic. So my first question is, how has COVID affected your field of study? What is your new normal, so to speak? So Dr. Marnie, I think you'd be a great person to start off with.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much. And thanks for inviting me to join this evening. Really excited to chat with you all. So yeah, I had a lovely introduction there from Salvatore, and I work at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. So if you've watched my talk, that's kind of these high impact, low probability events, typically called black swan events. I think COVID is used quite synonymously with black swan in many circumstances, but of course it isn't a black swan. It's the definition of the high impact is actually fairly low on the scale of what could be possible. So just to put that into context, the UK government pre-pandemic was supposed to be prepared for a pandemic situation, resulting in 350,000 deaths within the first 15 weeks. So on the scale of where we are, it's a relatively small event. So for us, it's been a real time of reflection. It's kind of demonstrated some of the problems that we've highlighted for a long period of time, the lack of risk thought and long-term thinking within our government structures. It's also kind of highlighted to us the real systemic nature of risk, and that it's a compound kind of situation where you can expose vulnerabilities in our health system, which then have knock-on implications into other systems as well, such as our education system, what we've seen struggling with the young generation. So that's been a real point of kind of change in our prioritization of the way in which we're thinking about risk. Certainly, we're thinking much more about its application and what it really looks like in the real world. And I think my talk kind of talks to a line of work that we've been doing at the centre, which very much focuses on how we can use the COVID pandemic as a kind of pedestal to start kind of getting a bit more action and mitigation towards these risks that we actually have the means to reduce, but are failing to do so for numerous reasons.
So in many ways, it's been very beneficial to have this, to give you a pedestal.
I mean, I don't want to say it's been beneficial because nobody wants to use a global pandemic for their own benefit, but certainly it's put global catastrophic risk on the table. And just one example to say that is one of the final comments that Dominic Cummings said as he left office was the thing that the government should be focusing on right now is existential risk. So there has been some positives, yeah.
Thank you. And Professor Girolami?
So one of the things that's been quite remarkable is that over the last year, there hasn't been a day go by where terms such as listening to the data, listening to the science has been on the television. And I think that this has been a time where the importance of science and science-led and data-led, evidence-led reasoning has really come to the fore. This has probably been quite almost a golden time, in fact, where science and statistical sciences have really been shown to be so important in navigating our way through this pandemic. And it was really interesting for Lara to talk about, risk one of the big issues, of course, is how do you quantify that risk? How do you quantify that uncertainty? And the whole notion of deep uncertainty is one that economists have been struggling with for a very long time. The notion of black swan events and so on. But the unknowns and the complexity of those unknown unknowns and how they ripple through and cascade are things that even defy the scientists on stage. So I think this last 12 months it's been quite something, being a scientist and being someone in the data sciences as well.
Thank you very much. And finally, on to Professor Nitschke. How has it affected you?
Yeah, it has been, echoing what Professor Girolami just said, a very interesting year to be a scientist. When the story that has been dominating the entirety of the news cycle has been a science story. And people are using it in different ways. I think it's interesting. It was also interesting to see, practical science manifesting itself in interesting ways. Regardless of whether or not you believe in evolution, for example, the virus is evolving and it's going to get you on account of that. So I think it's been interesting to see people's belief systems come head to head with hard science, and what has happened in that confluence has been interesting to watch. Practically, yeah, it's been terrible. I mean, it's been no fun at all. I'm really keen to see the back of it, although I don't know when that will happen at this rate. But yeah, it's been a hell of a year.
Thank you. And Professor Girolami and Professor Nitschke, in what you just said, you both touched on the importance of science and its applications during this pandemic. And so my question for you both is, an application of both of your talks could be the more effective delivery of drugs within the body. So could you both briefly touch on this? And when do you think we'll begin to see the efficacy of this in our lives? Professor Nitschke, do you want to start us off with that?
Okay, sure. Yeah, I mean, this isn't something that we touch on, I think, really directly. The cages that we make are probably too small and too toxic to do a good job of delivering drugs, at least currently in their current incarnation. So I think it's been really exciting seeing things like the mRNA vaccines coming out, which are encapsulated in an entirely different way. And that drug delivery, the vaccine delivery, has worked really well, even though it hadn't been deployed until the current crisis has come to a head, I think, at least to my fairly limited knowledge. Professor Girolami may perhaps be able to rectify my ignorance in this case. Yeah, I mean, I think drug delivery is important. Encapsulation is important. It's maybe not something that the kinds of molecules that we work on is best at doing, though.
Thank you. And Professor Girolami, did you want to say something on that?
So, my talk was on digital twins, and one of the things that I touched upon was the promise of the digital patient, and in particular, we looked at the work that has been done on the digital twin of the cardiac system, the heart in particular. Once you start going to drug delivery, drug efficacy, and the characterization and the modeling that's required is so complex, given the amount that we still do not understand at the subcellular or the cellular, and then even at the organ based level, that we are a very, very long way off from any major advances at that sort of scale. So I would temper the enthusiasm of the digital twin, the digital patient, that there is so much complexity, and there is so much that we still do not understand to be able to codify that in some formal mathematical representation, for example.
Thank you.
Next question I'd like to move on. Something I quite liked in your first answer, Professor Girolami, is you talked about how we are saying that we need to place emphasis on what the science says. And obviously a big place where this could be implemented is in our understanding of the existential risks found in global warming, reduction of biodiversity, etc. Do you think that your fields can guide us and help us to solutions here? And if so, how?
Yes, well, the sciences have been issuing the clarion call for quite some time that something needs to be done at a global scale to mitigate the catastrophic effects that we're going to be meeting sometime soon. And across all of the sciences, across all of the engineering disciplines, scientists, scientific groups are looking to see how they can meet the zero carbon targets, for example. And that goes right across the board. So if you think of companies such as Amazon and Google, whose focus has been on the great advances in AI, but those great advances in AI have required so much power, so much electrical power, that if anything, there has to be an almost revolution in the way that their business and their technologies develop to be able to meet these absolutely essential targets. But I would say that right across all of the sciences, there are groups, there are whole institutions that are focusing on how we, as I said, mitigate these potentially catastrophic risks that we're facing at the moment.
Thank you. And Dr. Marnie, I feel like you might have a lot to say over this as well.
I think Dr. Girolami did a brilliant kind of overview there, but I think one thing that is really important in all of this is all of these groups and people that we mentioned are ambassadors for these risks, and kind of really making sure that they're on the table in the kind of discussions of their mitigation and prevention. So I think that's really key. One of the problems with some of these risks, of course, is that they just aren't seen as priorities, and we're seeing that with the climate crisis because it's affecting somebody else somewhere else, that kind of classic not in my backyard approach, and they're really slow burn risks. So the effects we're seeing of climate change are incredibly long, and AI was mentioned there, and the real significant risks associated with the uses of AI are decades, supposedly. That could obviously shorten as advancements happen. But we're talking about, artificial general intelligence is decades away. But it's more about, there's these people working towards these challenges in many different groups, but it's really about kind of doing it before it's too late for some of these risks. So on many of these risks, we're already quite far down that road, but AI, we have a chance before this technology develops to actually make sure that we're ready to deal with the consequences that may occur with it. So it's really about thinking about these ethical and moral issues associated with the development of technology. And we're already seeing the impacts of the lack of that. So for example, the use of autonomous drones and things in warfare and biological weapons. And it's really about having not only just kind of reducing the risk in terms of science, but it's also in terms of having bodies and regulatory bodies that are dealing with this. So we have the Biological Weapons Convention. For nuclear risk, we had the Nuclear Ban Treaty that came in earlier this year. But yet, so many countries are still yet to join the Nuclear Ban Treaty, the UK being one of those. And obviously we had that news last week of Boris Johnson increasing the cap on the number of nuclear weapons. So as much as it is around obviously having the science to actually understand these risks, it's also about those kind of mechanisms about how we're communicating that and how we're getting that into policy spheres to actually kind of have the mechanisms to deal with the consequences of these risks too.
Yeah, and I think AI is going to be a great place to take this conversation as well. And I think Salve has a good question to follow up. I just want to quickly ask Professor Nitschke if there's anything else to add on the global warming question.
Yeah, I mean, it is, as Dr. Pani said, this sort of slow burn thing that is going to completely eclipse any COVID concerns that we have. If we can't deal with COVID, that doesn't bode well for our ability to deal with global warming, because I think a lot of the same sorts of societal responses, you know, putting common good over individual comfort, that sort of trade-off is going to play in a huge way in the years to come. So it'll be very interesting to see how we deal with this, because we're going to have to one way or another, hopefully sooner rather than later.
Cross our fingers. I think Salve has a good question now.
So AI has been spoken about a lot, and obviously in STEM, AI is something that now and in the future is going to become increasingly prevalent and increasingly more important. So Dr. Mani, you referred to the existential risk of the creation of general AI in your talk. Could you unpack the risks that are associated with it? And I wonder if you and the other panelists could speak as to how these risks might best be mitigated to avoid our own Marvel's Age of Ultron movement.
I can have a go. I'm sure I'm going to leave many gaps because it's not my whole area of expertise, but I can certainly unpack many of the big ones. So one of the biggest challenges is around creating AI systems that are aligned to correct values. So we call it the value alignment problem. And there's many different kind of approaches and ways of thinking about the value alignment problem. And this is really, when we talk about value alignment, it's how do we want that AI system that we're going to develop, if it truly has a consciousness or its own general intelligence, how do we align it to human values and understanding the way in which we as humans would make decisions? How can we ensure that the artificial intelligence is able to achieve the same? So for example, you'll probably, there's a video floating around from the UN that used the example of autonomous vehicles. How an autonomous vehicle decide, you know, it's driving down the road, an old lady's crossing from one side and a lady with a baby's crossing from the other. It has no, it has to hit one. Who does it hit? You know, it doesn't have to, but you know, it can't avoid one. That's the way to phrase that. And how do we set those values kind of within the systems that we create? So one of the problems around value alignment is the fact that it's a bit of a race within the tech industry. Whoever gets to the point of developing artificial and general intelligence is obviously going to benefit massively from that. And, you know, if it is a company that we perhaps are not so happy that has got to that point, might they align it to something that they believe is right, that actually doesn't fit to the rest of how other groups think about it? So that's particularly one issue. There's also many issues around how can we control a machine once we get that, where's the point in which we lose control? And there's some fabulous papers, and I can't recommend Superintelligence by Max Tegmark enough. That's a really great place to start. You know, could an AI machine get to the point that it's so smart that it can stop you from actually taking control or actually being able to disable it? And these kinds of issues. So, I mean, there's a multitude of issues, and we actually, it's a focus of quite a lot of people in our center. And one of the things is really getting junior AI researchers and people that are coming into this world to think about the ethical implications of the applications of AI. Is really one of our focuses. Yeah, I don't know if the other professors would like to add to my terrible definition of AI risk.
Well, let me perhaps put a different slant on things, and hopefully everyone that's listening will sleep a little bit better tonight after what I'm about to say. We are not at any time in the next decades, and perhaps even in the next century, going to be at risk of some artificial general intelligence running rampant across our societies. If I look at, if you remember a couple of years ago, the game of Go was able to be played by an AI system and was able to beat the Korean world champions. And this was a huge step forward in AI technology, because the game of Go is far more complex than the game of chess. And again, if you think of, so that was DeepMind from the UK. And then a few years before that, IBM's Watson was able to play the game Jeopardy, where an answer is given and you have to figure out what the question is, so the sort of inverse type problem. And these were all hailed as fantastic advances in AI. But if you lift the lid and look inside and see what exactly is happening, you will see things such as Markov decision processes, nonlinear function optimization methods, binary or randomized binary tree searches. These are all mathematical methods that actually probably Ben and Salvatore, you might well meet when you're studying the natural sciences, that are very cleverly engineered and put together in some software. But in terms of an AI, it's a million miles away. So having said that, we still need to think about the ethics and the ethical issues around the use of software that employs algorithms, that exhibits some notion of intelligence, that exhibits some way of reasoning from data, reasoning from observations, forward in time or in the causal chain. So there are still risks, but they are not because we are developing artificial intelligences. It's because we are developing software systems and using data in ways that exhibit some notion of intelligence. But we're a million miles away from, beating the world champion at Go is an enormous feat. It's one of the things that this generation should be really proud of. But it's so far away from reasoned argument and the nuances of composing music and so on. So on the one hand, there is risk. On the other hand, let's keep it in perspective.
So out of curiosity, Dr. Marnie, is this a similar vibe that's being held at SAGE? This sort of is a problem, but it's not a problem we can expect to see from even a century. Was the timescale given?
I mean, I totally echo what Professor Girolami has just said there. It is decades away, but we are progressing along this line, and very much there's a lot of money being poured into this. And I think what is really important to just reiterate here is that the people that are asking for regulation and control in AI are the people that are developing the tech. They're the ones that are saying, look, before this gets too far, we need to already have mitigated this and think about this. So I think, that's a really important point. Sorry, I've just forgotten the question you've asked me. Can you ask me again, please?
Do you agree with the timescale given by Professor Girolami?
Oh yeah, okay. So yes and no. Certainly we are seeing probably more rapidly than we would probably have said before. So yes, we are very far, very, very far away from truly intelligent conscious machines. But for example, the GPT-3 model that came out earlier this year, which is a language spoofing kind of AI system, and you can ask it questions and it will respond, and it comes out with very creepy things. Somebody asked it if it had intelligence, and it said, "I'm too intelligent," or "My answer would blow your brains," or something like the very creepy kind of answer. But the kind of evolution from the previous model of GPT-2 to GPT-3 and where we are now, that was expected to be decades, and we're 5 years later. So some things, they are developing faster than we would probably like. And the regulation is very critical that the regulation keeps up.
So now we're going to move into more individual questions for the speakers. And so the first one I have is for Professor Nitschke. So Professor Nitschke, in your talk, you mentioned both the cages themselves and their applications, both of which are really interesting and fascinating. So my question is, do you design the cage first, then think of its applications, or design the cage with a particular application in mind?
We generally stumble upon the cage and then try to figure out what it might be good for. I mean, it's not really, design is a big word. I think we're getting towards design. We can design some degree of structure now. But yeah, I mean, we started out really just stumbling from one structure to another. And, you know, you can extend out from a place where you are based on some simple geometrical principles and what you know about coordination chemistry. And that lets you then build out some bigger structures or more interesting different structures. And then you come up with something entirely that you didn't expect at all. And then you can build on that in new ways. But yeah, we come up with a structure first, and then we try to figure out what it might be good for the most part.
Thank you. And so how long do you think it will be before we see cages such as yours used widely in industry?
I don't know. I mean, if you read one of my grant proposals, it's going to be right at the end of the grant proposal every time. It's tough to say, really. That depends a lot on industry and what they're interested in. They have things that they like to do, and we're talking to industry. We're talking to BP now. We have a project with BP. We have another project with a pharmaceutical company that I can't really talk about very much, that, you know, I think is pretty directly relevant. So, I mean, they're investing, I guess, in what we do. And that means they are hoping, I guess, to get some payout from that. But yeah, I mean, in a big way, I'm not sure. There's a huge amount of capital investment that's gone into, for example, separations in the form of petroleum distilling, you know, plants, basically. And those aren't going to be replaced anytime soon until we really rethink what we're doing with petroleum in the first place, and thinking about it more in terms of a useful source of molecules that we want to build things out of, as opposed to something to burn. So there has to be some degree of paradigm shift before I think we're going to get a wide rollout, but we're working on it.
Thank you.
We have a question for Professor Girolami from Lewis Hill. In your talk, you briefly mentioned how marine propulsion could be improved by the mimicking of the motion of manta rays and stingrays. To what extent does the future of engineering lie in biomimicry?
So that's a great question. And in many ways, if you go back and look at the history of some of the great advances in engineering and how they have been, or how they faltered initially, think of flight. The original ideas was to mimic the biology, which was to actually have wings that flapped, and didn't quite work out until it was understood the physics of the use of a wing in terms of creating a pressure differential and therefore an upward force. So I think that biomimicry is maybe not so prevalent, but inspiration from biology certainly is something that has probably got much more traction, has probably got much more of a track record in delivering advances in technology. So, you know, the biomimicry we were talking about, or you know, we demonstrated with the the design of hulls and ships and so forth, is a very nice example of the potential. But there are lots of other examples, flight being one of them, where you know, relying on the physics rather than the, you know, how the biology has actually evolved to produce a solution to a problem is probably going to deliver in terms of making advances.
Thank you very much.
So now I've got a question for Dr. Manny. So you mentioned in your talk that you work on volcanic risk. So just how catastrophic would it be if a supervolcano, such as the one at Yellowstone, erupted? And what measures should we have in place to minimize the damage that it would cause?
Have you asked me this? Because I am a volcanologist, that is my background. Yeah, no, I kind of stumbled into existential risk. So, and I'm so happy to set the record straight that you should not be worried about Yellowstone. If there is something you should worry about, it's certainly not Yellowstone. And actually, since I've joined the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, I've actually been thinking about this quite a lot. And I think the way in which we talk about volcanic risk on that really catastrophic level certainly isn't related to one large eruptive event, if we are going to see it in a kind of human timescale. Certainly, I don't believe that to be the case. The occurrence intervals of these very large, what we call volcanic explosivity index size 9 eruptions are hundreds of thousands, if not, you know, millions of years. Sorry, I've forgotten English for a second. Anyway, so actually the way that I now think, what is the way that I'm starting to think much more is around the systemic nature of the risk. And actually what I think is more important here is our vulnerability. And so the example being that since, you know, these large scale eruptions, perhaps the biggest on human history is the Tambor eruption of 1815. Even since then, our global systems have changed drastically. And one of the biggest things that has changed is our reliance on global critical systems. So within our societies now, we're reliant on shipping lanes. And this is so topical for today with the Suez Canal being blocked. And that's actually an issue that I've been thinking around. So maritime shipping routes that are responsible for transporting our fuel, our energy, our food, all around the world. We have a massive network of communications cables that you know, transport trillions of dollars in the financial markets and keep our societies going. And in all of this, we're not thinking about volcanic risk. And many of these areas where we find a kind of like an area where we have like a high density of these really critical vulnerable systems are actually in volcanic zones. And so there's a kind of, it's more about the vulnerability now. And one of the examples there is obviously the Icelandic eruption from 2010, which very small eruption, only a VI4, and it's a logarithmic scale, so a very small eruption, but was able to shock our global system. And it was a remote kind of location. So put that near somewhere like the Straits of Malacca in Indonesia, we have the port of Singapore, you have critical cables, and it transports 40% of the global fuel through the maritime shipping routes, and you've got a bit more of a problem.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And a question for you all from George Sherwin. So a common theme in your earlier answers is a lack of prioritization put towards science and big decisions. will we be able to fight off the next pandemic better than we did COVID-19? Or is this more of a political issue rather than a technological one? So, Professor Nitschke, perhaps first?
Sure. I mean, it's been very interesting to see different societies deal with the pandemic in different ways. And yeah, the ones who elected populists didn't do so well, really. That's been, I think, a useful lesson, maybe, hopefully. Whereas places like New Zealand, fared pretty well indeed. And, a lot of that's geography, but I think a lot of it was the response they made too. So yeah, I don't know. I hope we learned a thing or two. It's always hard to say. I guess we'll be able to say a little bit more next time. But it does seem like the places that had to deal with SARS V1 dealt a lot better with SARS V2 also. So maybe there's a bit of hope from that.
I think that's a very wise point. And Dr. Marnie, do you agree?
Yes, I do agree. The example of New Zealand, I think, is so fantastic. And one of the reasons I'm convinced that New Zealand also did so brilliantly added to their geography is because they have a history of dealing with risk. They are vulnerable to earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, all sorts of risks. So, and biosecurity obviously being quite a big one for them too. And they have mechanisms in place to deal with that. So I'm not surprised that they did so brilliantly. And another example of that's Iceland as well, that's also done so well. So that's one thing for me. I think there are many lessons from COVID in all different shapes and forms. And really, I think for me, the biggest lesson is I come from science communication and the importance of communication. And I think there's only been a handful of really excellent examples of communication during the pandemic. And it's something that I think the UK government, I really enjoyed listening to the other talks and the other speakers and the fabulous talk on linguistics during the pandemic, and from Professor Thorne, and him mentioning, there was no linguist involved in the COVID response, I think is fascinating. Like, why wouldn't we use people who are specialists in communication and language? And there certainly wasn't a communicator either. So there's a lot around that. I think that it has been, for me personally, has been a real point of learning. And I think, a lot around just understanding that we don't know all the answers, but we must learn from the past and things that we have experienced. So we could have learned from SARS, we could have learned from MERS, we could have learned from scenario exercises that were run in the years before Operation Sickness, as I mentioned in my talk. That's really key for me.
And Professor Girolami, are you hopeful that we'll learn from this pandemic as well?
Yes, I'm absolutely sure that we will. But I think, just to follow on from the previous two responses, is that we can't decouple technological from societal and political reasoning, that they are all coupled together in a very complex way. And that's why we see differences in societies that have responded well to this pandemic, because they have learned previously, or they have a society, societally they are more obedient, for example, to political diktats and so on. So I suppose what I'm saying is that really when we consider these things, the three elements of societal, political, and technical are all coupled in quite a complex way.
Thank you very much.
And so now, as we're moving into the sort of final stages of this Q&A, I wanted to ask you all, given the discussions that we've had so far this afternoon, Is there a question that one of you guys would like to ask another member of the panel?
Well, I would love to ask Mani about Dr. Mani about this whole notion of radical uncertainty, and how her centre actually can deal with that. It's something, as a statistician, one always thinks that probability is the way to describe uncertainty. But when you're dealing with radical uncertainty, the unknown unknowns, as I mentioned previously, then it's not entirely clear just exactly what can be done, if anything.
What an excellent question. Possibly one of the hardest challenges we have is the unknown unknowns. I think the first is acknowledging that there are unknown unknowns. We do lots of exercises in future thinking and horizon scanning to try to identify these things, which is one of our biggest kind of areas. And it's, safe to say the UK government also have a foresight team that work on these risks. When it comes to this is one of the biggest challenges with these kind of existential global catastrophic risks, is putting any kinds of probability, any kind of certainty on anything at all. That is one of the biggest challenges of these things. And I believe that to be the main challenge of why no one is acting on climate change. And I think really the only way we can kind of deal with that is just be transparent and say, look, we believe that there are things that we need to be aware of and that might come on the horizon. We don't know what they are, but we need to have contingencies in place, ready to deal with anything that might occur. And certainly there are many risks that, we start to think about, and we're like, actually, this now is falling into the realms. So we're discovering kind of these risks all the time. And yeah, it's just about kind of acknowledging what we do know, but also acknowledging what we don't know and just doing the work to find out what they are and kind of get them onto the table as soon as we think they are. But this is something that, again, is something that needs to be echoed in governance systems. We need to have longer term thinking in governments. We need to have positions that deal with risk. We need a chief risk officer within our governments and on the global platform to be able to have this longer term thinking around risk.
Can I just follow up on that? So there's costs always associated with, of course, preparing for risks. How do you decide how much to spend for a given risk?
This is such a brilliant question. And the answer is, I have no idea. So just for example, I've been working a little bit in planetary defense and asteroid risk. And I recently had the conversation with the planetary defense officer for NASA. And I asked him what his budget was for dealing with asteroid risk or near-Earth object impact. And it was
That's a great job title.
Amazing. He's brilliant too. But $150 million, and that was it. 150 million. It's nothing to protect the entire planet from a potential near-Earth object. So yeah, it's a how long is a piece of string, I guess, and depending on that. But it's difficult to quantify.
And would you have a question to ask any of our other speakers, Dr. Mani?
I'm quite interested in more personally on your kind of careers and how you've kind of thought about where you've got to, what you think is some of your thinking about the work that you've kind of presented as part of this group, and what your kind of takeaways or what you want to see as a result of this kind of work that you do. What is your ultimate impact and goal?
Professor Nitschke, do you want to start us off with that one?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I've come to think that probably my job is more to do with training teachers than anything else. Most of them are university teachers of one sort or another. And that seems to be a function of Cambridge by and large also, is to produce people who then go out and spread knowledge. So Yeah, it has to do with knowledge creation and knowledge diffusion. Those are the two functions that we fulfill. And they're interrelated in a way that, they have to be for a university to function. But that's really, I think, what my job has come to become.
Thank you. Professor Girolami, did you want to answer Dr. Mani's question?
Yes, I mean, I would agree. I think that my view is pretty much the same as Professor Nitschke's. That I think one of the greatest things that we can do is produce the next generation of thinkers, doers, teachers, and yeah, that's probably what really excites me. Although it's pretty cool just being able to decide I'm interested in X today, I'm going to go to X and hopefully contribute to what X is all about. But summarizing, I completely agree with Professor Nitschke that that's really what we want to, and what we're being paid to do, which is to develop the next generation of thinkers and doers.
I have one last question that won't take up much more of your time. Thank you for those answers. So, what do you think the next 12 months holds for your field, and what difference would this make for the general public? So we go back to Girolami to start, perhaps.
So, I mean, the field, well, I represent a number of areas of, from the statistical sciences, the data sciences, right through to the engineering sciences. And I think that the last 12 months have been, absolutely astounding as far as the statistical sciences have been concerned. I think this next 12 months will continue in that regard because of the importance of being able to gain insight and crucial information from the limited amounts of data that we get about the rising cases, about the risk of the virus evolving and what particular impact that is going to have. So I think it's going to be quite a roller coaster, both for the statistical data and engineering sciences for the next 12 months.
And Professor Nitschke?
I hope I'll be able to see my friends again at conferences. This is something I really miss. A lot of the business of being an academic is seeing people and talking to them. And maybe some people have the idea that ideas emerge out of a lone thinker on the top of the ivory tower just thinking deep thoughts, but no, that's not how it works at all. You come up with new ideas by talking to people, and the ideas emerge out of these conversations. And the lack of these conversations over the past 12 months has been just awful. And I think I'm really looking forward to being able to do this again. I mean, even within my research group, we've been working shifts, and we haven't been able to talk to each other nearly to the degree that we have in the past, and that's been problematic. And I haven't been able to talk to my colleagues at other universities and other places, and that's also been not great. So hopefully that will open up again, and that will become, I don't want to say back to normal, but we'll at least be able to communicate better than we have been. Because I mean, look at us now. I was really looking forward to coming down to Guildford and seeing you guys, and being able to listen to the other speakers' talks and being able to interact directly. But yeah, this is a thin wire that we're talking over right now, and it sucks. It's terrible. I don't like it. I'm really looking forward to getting off of it.
Hopefully it's onwards and upwards from here, though. Thank you for that. And Dr. Mani, what's the next 12 months hold for your research into existential risks?
Yeah, so we're quite ready to really start getting some kind of traction on some of the issues that were already kind of highlighted by the pandemic. So really risk thinking, and this already started with our centre's kind of initiated a House of Lords inquiry into the way that government think about risk. And so we're hoping that that's opening the doors to conversations about how we quantify and identify risks that are posed to the UK. And yeah, really for us, I mean, that's where we've always been. We've always been trying to get global catastrophic and existential risk onto the table. It's definitely gaining more traction. But I actually live in France, and here the culture around global catastrophic risk and existential risk is phenomenal. I've had, out walking my dog, someone's ended up talking to me, oh yeah, I know all about this. And, I've been within the risk field in the UK for a very long time, and even people within this field don't understand existential risk. So we've got a long way to go. But really that's where we want to be with it. We want this to be the new normal. We want this to be everybody able to talk about global catastrophic risk, understand what it is, and actually have it somewhere on the tables in these discussions going forward. We're also, we're really quite passionate about making sure that the kind of messages that come through COVID are representative of actually what happened, and making sure that those voices are heard when these kind of decisions are made. It's not just about making decisions, it's about making decisions that actually these decisions you make affect people, and people can result in the substantial loss of life that we're seeing from COVID if the decisions aren't made. So really that kind of approach is where we are within our centre.
Thank you also very much. I think those answers really summed up what has been a very interesting conversation over the past 45 minutes. I'd like to start by saying thank you to everyone for coming to listen to what was a very engaging conversation, as I say, and also a massive thank you to our speakers for taking the time to provide talks and also to come here this evening to provide such a fulfilling discourse. Hope you will have an excellent rest of your evening. Thank you all very much.